Nuclear war unfolds in seconds and minutes, not in hours and days and weeks. And that is terrifying, and that is a fact. I was really surprised to learn that in the event that NATO needs to get involved, they need permission from the President of the United States to use the nuclear weapons. America has approximately 5,000 nuclear weapons.
That's too much.
Thank you very much. We live in this idea that nuclear war will never happen. It's a common phrase across the Defense Department. It goes, deterrence will hold. I mean, that sounds very willful.
Dzień dobry, moi drodzy. Witam w Imponderabiliach. Ja nazywam się Karol Paciorek, a dziś goszczę Annie Jacobsen, amerykańską autorkę, finalistkę nagrody Pulitzera, która zajmuje się tematem wojskowości, wywiadu, broni, a jej najnowsza książka, Wojna, nuklearna, możliwy, scenariusz, dotyka konfliktu nuklearnego w bardzo ekstremalnym wydaniu i jest to opowieść minuta po minucie, godzina po godzinie od wystrzelania pierwszej rakiety międzykontynentalnej i o tej książce właśnie będziemy mówić. Hello Annie, it's great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Please, let's start with this. Tell me why you decided to take on this topic, because did you have a feeling that the scenario you describe in the book is actually possible? Because it's very extreme.
It is very extreme. Thank you for noticing.
Yeah.
Hard not to, I suppose.
Yes.
This is not my first rodeo, as we say in the United States. I'm an author. I'm a national security reporter. And specifically why I wrote this book, on top of the fact that I wanted to demonstrate in, appalling detail just how absolutely horrific nuclear war would be. But the reason that I chose to write the book, in my previous 6 books that all deal with the Pentagon, the CIA, military operations, intelligence operations, imagine how many of those people said to me, Annie, I did what I did to prevent nuclear World War III. And so during the previous administration, when we had former President Trump having that kind of verbal duel with the leader of North Korea, you may recall, my button's bigger. They were threatening nuclear exchange. And I began to think, my God, what happens if prevention, another word for that is deterrence, fails? And I decided to write this book.
Most of it covers a period of 1 hour. How did you come up with that kind of structure?
Right. I mean,
but
you learn...
not whole book.
Well, you learn very quickly in this book that nuclear war unfolds in seconds and minutes, not in hours and days and weeks. And that is terrifying, and that is a fact. But to answer your question specifically, because it has a very specific, unforgettable moment for me as a reporter, which I was doing an interview with the commander of U.S. Strategic Command. Now, most people don't know what that is. STRATCOM, it is called, is the commander of STRATCOM is the steward of the nuclear arsenal. He's the commander in charge of it and also the nuclear forces. So in the event of a nuclear launch necessary by the United States as a counterattack to someone attacking us, the President of the United States speaks directly to the STRATCOM commander. There's no one in between them. And I was sitting with the former commander of STRATCOM, General Keeler. And we were talking about what would happen in a full-scale nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States. And he said to me, Annie, the world could end in the next couple of hours. And that is precisely how I knew what my structure was going to be. Seconds and minutes.
An hour, and then
72 minutes.
Yes.
72. A couple of hours is 2 hours.
Yes.
And that's essentially this, the first part of, I think, the shocking factor of this book, and there are many, is when you realize as a reader, as a reporter, how fast this all happens. We have no control.
Yeah, actually reading this book takes more time than actually living through, or not actually living through the events. How did you balance the scientific and the fictional aspect of of the narrative.
Mm-hmm. And I would say also that maybe instead of fictional, I always say it's hypothetical.
Sure.
Because it is fact-based and it is scientific-based. And so, and any reader...
But it's just a scenario. Yeah. It's like one very specific, narrow, I would say.
Yes. It is, but what's also interesting is nuclear war a scenario, not nuclear war the only scenario.
Yes.
How do you balance, as a reporter, it seems you're asking me, taking the science and the technology and the fact and thread it through a narrative in a manner that presents itself as nonfiction? Maybe is that a little bit what you're asking?
Well, maybe I'm trying to figure out your personal take on the choosing the scenario, because you, at some point you had to choose.
Yeah, why I chose
why
North
this
Korea.
person will act like this, or why, for example, European countries with the nuclear power will respond that kind of way or different.
Yes, okay. So some of the moments were very specific. Like, for example, how is NATO going to respond? I myself, a reporter who presumably knew quite a bit about this, I was really surprised to learn that in the event that NATO needs to get involved, they need permission from the President of the United States to use the nuclear weapons, as well as that of the UK. I didn't know that. So those specific facts are tied to actual protocols of nuclear command and control. Readers can find that in the back. But the more subtle decisions that I think are very interesting, certainly to me, like I'll give you an example without spoiling here, but at a very critical moment, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, who has taken over for the president for reasons that are, we can also talk about how I sourced that. The SecDef has to make a decision of whether or not he's going to kill a lot of people simply because ... We'll let readers figure that out. And that specifically, if you go to the notes, you realize those came from a conversation that I had with former U.S. Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, now in his 90s, who I asked him if he could tell me what he would do in that precise scenario. And so I found that by being able to use the thoughts, being able to express the thoughts of former people in these extraordinary positions really gave this authenticity to the scenario that becomes incredibly psychologically complex and also morally complex.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Let's talk about some of the basics. Please tell us what is the American nuclear triad, because that's one of the most important concepts.
Yeah. And everything has this kind of nuclear nomenclature to it, right? Like it's meant to kind of keep people at a distance. And yet it's very simple, like nuclear triad. You think that's above my sort of pay grade. Well,
there are some threes in that, so.
Yeah, but exactly. And then triad, 3. Okay, so America has 3 elements of its nuclear forces. There are ICBMs in silos, buried in silos in the ground.
ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Yes, intercontinental ballistic
that's very
missiles.
important.
But again, you might think, that sounds so intimidating. Well, it's just like it sounds. It goes from one continent to the next as a ballistic missile, just using gravity.
But the time is very important. Timing is just 20-something.
A launch pad, Russia to the United States, 26 minutes, 40 seconds. Pyongyang to the United States, 33 minutes. You get the idea. And so readers realize, my God, this all happened. If that is the amount of time. And by the way, an ICBM, very important, cannot be redirected and it cannot be recalled. Once it launches, it is coming to its target. So the second part of the triad are the submarines. They have submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs. And that, we can get into that. I mean, they don't call them the handmaidens of the apocalypse for nothing. They are terrifying. Third part of the triad, the bomber force. We have B-52s and the B-2 stealth bombers. And that is it. Those 3 elements create the nuclear forces in the United States, and they can be launched in a minute to about 14 minutes for the subs, a couple hours for the bombers. This is how fast nuclear war will begin.
And if I understand this correctly, all parts of the triad are always on, right? They're always somewhere, either cruising or being ready, being prepared to actually attack, right?
Absolutely. And again, okay, so let's talk numbers while we're on this. America has approximately 5,000 nuclear weapons.
That's too much.
Thank you very much. I'm glad we are in agreement.
I live in Poland.
Okay,
so, yeah.
I show you what one target, one megaton thermonuclear bomb hitting Washington, D.C. does. And we have 5,000. Russia has 5,000. Of those, the ones that are on what are called hair trigger alert, again, just like it sounds, ready for launch status. America has 1,770. Russia has 1,674. That's called parity. We have approximately the same. And also for readers, basics, they're set up to kind of be pointing at one another in this idea of deterrence, that our weapons are ready for launch, our nuclear weapons, and so are yours, so no one will be insane enough to launch these nuclear weapons. That's known as MAD, mutual assured destruction. And that is the fundamental premise of deterrence. But again, what I do in this book is say, what would happen if deterrence failed?
And how did you research all the fields that you actually put in the book?
Yeah. I mean, as a reporter, it's like follow the lead. You just ask one. Once General Keeler said to me the world could end in 72 minutes, I understood my job is now to figure out what happens in second one, second two, because this is obviously, if something this big, the $1 trillion command and control system, these nuclear weapons that have been with us in America for 79 years, this system is a science. It is a systematic system of systems. What happens? And so the reporting process becomes about exactly that. Let's start in second one. And then you begin to realize how overwhelming it is on the one hand, and also how frighteningly simple.
Is it though?
I think it
because
is.
That was I think that was my main concern, is maybe too big, but my main thought was, is it actually that simple? Because we know from pop culture and books and everything that there is a football, so the briefcase that the American president is carrying and everything, but there are other people. There are some procedures. There is something that actually can prevent from accidents and from wrong decisions, let's say. So,
by all means, and I believe that what you're referring to is that period of time which is called deterrence, which we live in, which we hope to live in forever, which sounds a bit fantastical to me. We live in this idea that nuclear war will never happen. It's a common phrase across the Defense Department. It goes, deterrence will hold. I mean, that sounds very willful. Deterrence will hold. They can repeat it like a mantra. But in my research, when I came across the deputy commander of STRATCOM, Lieutenant General Thomas Bussier is his name. And I found a situation where he was speaking to a group of generals. And he said, deterrence will hold unless it doesn't. And if it doesn't, it all unravels. And my God, that word of unraveling stuck with me. So to answer your question in another way, I think the job of the journalist is, you've got this guy saying, it unravels if it doesn't hold. What does that unraveling look like? And maybe the last point that I find interesting that you're raising in my brain is that it is a system. It's a mechanized system. So I can tell you precisely what would happen if a strategic ballistic missile is coming at the United States. This policy moves into effect. All of these different organizations have what happens next. But we're all humans within this system. And it's when the decision trees begin to spread out and you begin to have competing interests, the Secret Service saying, wait a minute, it's our job to protect the life of the president. We're going to move him. And guess what? We have the biggest weapons, so we're going to win. Versus the generals who are saying, no, we need the president to get the launch order. And so that is where things go awry. And that is where I found the most sort of deep horror in all of this, that we're all just humans working within this big system.
I believe, or maybe for me, these parts of the book are most like action-based, let's say. And also you write for the TV, so you know how to do it. But let's move on. Why did you? I hope I'm not spoiling too much. But the country that started all of it, it's not Russia. Surprise, surprise. It is North Korea. So why?
And, I'm going to give the ultimate spoiler alert, just because, we can get that out of the way.
Yeah.
After the 72 minutes, nuclear winter, 5 billion people are dead. And what I find shocking in an amazing way as an author, and perhaps very gratifying, is that all of these people are reading it. And they read it, they say to me, and I read your book in one day, I couldn't stop. And yet everybody knows how it ends in this scenario, 5 billion dead. But there's something human that you want to see. How on earth is this possible? And you get to the end and you just say, this is possible, and that is terrifying. And then hopefully you give the book to your neighbor to read, because that is the point of it. To answer your question, which was, how did I choose North Korea? Another very critical interview for me. So on the cover of the book is a actual photograph from Los Alamos Laboratory.
Oh, really?
Yes, that is a 10...
In the era of Mid-Journey, you never know. So.
Yes.
Okay.
That is a 10.4 megaton thermonuclear weapon exploded in the Pacific Islands as a test by the Defense Department in 1952. And that's the first thermonuclear explosion. A thermonuclear bomb is so much more powerful than an atomic bomb, like the one dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that bomb uses an atomic bomb inside of itself as a triggering device. Think about that power. Now, I'm digressing to how I got to this North Korea, but it does play into effect here because that bomb was designed by a man named Richard Garwin. He was 24 years old when he drew the plans. He's in his 90s now, and I interviewed him at length for the book. He is essentially the smartest man in the room when it comes to nuclear weapons. He's advised every president since Eisenhower. And I asked Richard Garwin what worried him most, just like you're asking me. How do we imagine the worst case scenario? And he told me that what scared him most was a madman, a rogue individual with a nuclear arsenal. And he called it Mad King logic. And he said that some leaders are like Napoleon. And he used the French phrase, après moi, le déluge, which is like, after me, the flood. He said that's what scared him. And I took that to mean the leader of North Korea. Because even though there are no rules to nuclear war once it begins, it is just all out kill. The period of deterrence that we live in has rules. And Russia abides by them. The United States abides by them. Other countries technically abide by them. North Korea defies them. And that is why I chose North Korea as taking the initial bolt out of the blue attack against America.
But it's kind of irrational to think that when you start that kind of conflict, that kind of war, you can escape anywhere. actually. You say about the bunker inside of the mountain.
Yeah.
But it's not like you can escape and go out after a week or two or a month because you take a risk that there's going to be nothing after that time. So I'm thinking any leader knows that, actually. Somehow knows that. Or if he doesn't, then he has some advisors who actually do. So isn't that, the brake pedal of all this?
What a great word, the brake pedal. And I would hope one would hope that the brake pedal is there. And so far it has been. But and I think breaking down that fantasy of that the bunkers don't really work was an important part of the reporting for me. And actually even reporting that the Defense Department knows the bunkers don't work. In the same way that the Defense Department knows the ability to shoot down an incoming nuclear missile doesn't really work. And so you have this several layers of facade, of fantasy, of the veil that are supporting the idea of deterrence. It will hold. And, but I think why that interview with Richard Garwin, where he suggested to me the Mad King was the most dangerous element of the threat to deterrence, why it stuck with me so much and it haunts me still, is because you can't defend against that. You cannot defend against après moi le déluge. It's just the sort of fatalistic, all it takes is the fatalistic vision of a madman with a nuclear arsenal. And so it kind of brings you back to the question of, well, I think readers take away the idea that they say, wait a minute, there's 9 billion of us on the planet, and yet the fate of the world is held in the hands of these 9 leaders with nuclear arsenals. This is insanity. How did this happen? Why are we here? And how do we unwind this?
Did you have any other leaders in mind, like current U.S. president or maybe future president of the United States? Do you consider them, one of them, Harris or Biden, better or worse in possible scenario?
I thought about all the different presidents. I am an author who does not put politics into my writing. So I refer to POTUS,
sure.
President of the United States. And sometimes they get called...
But it's difficult to, think about some imaginary president, right?
But I also, I think there's strengths and weaknesses of all the individual players. But maybe tell me the question one more degree of context. Like, was I thinking specifically about a certain president when I was writing?
I think that maybe because in a discourse in the past years, some people were saying, "Oh, Donald Trump is great because he's a cowboy. Right. He won't step back. He'll be protecting the America." And some will say he's not that good. Someone younger should be replacing him. And you can look at the problem or at the POTUS in many different ways. I'm thinking about your approach on this.
Well, my approach was the absolute shock when I was told this by a former Secretary of Defense when it comes to the president. Bill Perry told me most presidents come into office, most U.S. presidents, unaware of their responsibility as commander-in-chief with regards to a nuclear war.
Because you cannot actually be prepared for that, right?
Bingo. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. And so they get the briefing right before they come in. And so they know they are in charge. They know they have what's called sole presidential authority, just like it sounds. They're in charge. They don't have to ask permission of anyone. So they know that. But what Bill Perry also said was that most remain unaware while they're in office. And then he said most don't want to know. And so this is astonishing to me. It seems from my looking at history that with the exception of perhaps President Obama, he did understand a bit more from what I understand and had an interest in pursuing concepts around nuclear war. But then other things come into play. American presidents have wars they are fighting. Certainly the case there. They have popularity. They have to deal with the economy. They have to deal, right? So they become consumed with what they see as more matters at hand because this idea of nuclear war remains in everyone's mind as this theoretical concept. It will never happen. Deterrence will hold. What is shocking to me is that when I began reporting this book during COVID, and one of the great sort of circumstantial fortunes of that for me as a reporter was that many people had a little more time on their hands and were willing to do a Zoom with someone like me. And I'm talking about retired generals and admirals and advisors to the president who would normally be off at such and such a conference or giving this speech and wouldn't be able to see me per se. And also usually a reporter like myself wants to have a face-to-face interview, so there's that sense of trust. And so that involves a lot of flying, and you have to work out schedules. In COVID, this concept of Zoom developed. And so I had a remarkable situation where, Richard Garwin and I did hours of Zooms. What a concept. And I could really move into more questioning than I can normally do. And, the takeaway from all of that was really interesting to me was that these individuals at the end stage of their life had an ability to reflect on their selves as a younger man. Most of them are men in nuclear command and control, certainly in the old days in America. And then they were able to share with me their thoughts and reflections on mortality, on existential threats, on how dangerous it is that this idea of deterrence is a theoretical concept.
I don't want to be too harsh on them, but when you're like 80 or something and you reflect on mortality when you were working on nuclear defense or any kind of aspect of this, then it's probably too late. That's one. Right? Because
listen, I find this very, very, very interesting to contemplate, okay? Because you could say yes, or you could say, wow, wait a minute, you know what? It's better than nothing.
Okay.
You could say, because here's the thing.
Yes, you could.
Because, we're having a conversation about it. Because what ends up happening, I believe, particularly if these are people that are deeply respected in the communities in which they serve, and they are not defying their brethren, they are not changing their position per se. They are expressing kind of a little bit of remorse and maybe even regret for not having the wisdom that only comes with old age. And so that is why I appreciate and value interviewing elder people so much, because they have the wisdom and they have the experience. And then it gets passed on through me to a younger generation. And then you have that interesting concept of legacy, which is really at the heart of the matter. Because if we have a nuclear war, there is no legacy, literally. There's no history. There's no net legacy. There's no nothing. We know from the end of the book with Nuclear Winter, all of this disappears. And that is a lot to wrap your head around. But it's a worthy thought experiment.
Absolutely. One question just came up to me. Do you think that if there would be just more women in the military, would it be any different?
I mean,
you're a good person to ask. So.
I mean, I love that you asked that question, and I ask that question, and I do think about it, and I don't have an answer, and I'll tell you why. Because mostly it would be supposition, right? Because most of the military hierarchy in the United States has historically been male.
Yes.
And so most of my sources have been male. And sometimes I receive criticism. People say, Annie, there's not enough women in your book. Well, and I said, well, there weren't women in nuclear command and control. Well, you should have interviewed more analysts. Well, that's not the point. I don't want to necessarily interview outsiders' opinion on the individuals. I want to interview the individuals. And so I would hope moving forward that my books have more women in them as women begin to participate in these formerly very male structures.
And do they?
Well, look at who we have running for president.
Oh, yeah. That's true. That's true. Yeah. And it's changing also in the other countries.
And in my book, there's the vice chairman of the Chiefs of Staff is a woman, and she is based on a woman. And if anyone's wondering who individuals are based on, they can look in the notes and read about that person and then learn about their biography. And it is interesting to realize women, particularly women scientists, exist in very high places in the military. They just tend to be a little bit more discreet.
Yeah. Don't you think that's kind of ironic that the only country that has ever used nuclear weapon against people is actually under attack in your book, not the initial aggressor?
Well, thank you for pointing out the irony that I also believe,
yes.
Which is precisely the point. I mean, one can never and should never move away from the fundamental concept that America created this problem. You know, and it's why the Oppenheimer movie is so powerful to me, because it highlights this idea that this is a American problem at its core, at its origin story, and origin stories are profoundly interesting. With that said, you could also say that gives America the great opportunity to be the leader for the change, to find the solution. Because if you have read not just this book, but you read any of my other books, you know, because I report on the power of the presidential pen. The executive order, what the United States president can do with a pen is astonishing. And so, yes, you need the support of the people. And so, I mean, I write books because I hope people read them and they think to themselves, I have a little more say than I think I do, because it's sort of when you have movements happen, then the president, always concerned with their popularity, thinks more seriously about picking up that pen.
But it is kind of crazy that it lays down in the hands of one person, basically. It's really crazy.
You know, the idea of sole presidential authority is so fascinating and shocking to me. And here's another interesting
You cannot
concept.
imagine how crazy it is for someone from here.
Right? And you know, and here's the thing is, I also write, I'm a very popular writer, meaning I write for the people. That's what popular means. So yes, I'm read by the generals at the Pentagon, but I'm also read by the little old ladies in South Dakota. That's my audience. I really believe that none of these issues should be so rarefied that there's this sense of like, oh, we know more. You know, the people are really quite smart when you give them information that's understandable. It's why I go to guys like Richard Garwin, you know, because the middle of the road people will often, what I call, obfuscate the facts, probably because they don't know them as deeply, and they try and make them sound very complex. This is just perhaps my bias. But when you go to the smartest men in the room or the smartest women in the room, they tell it to you in the simplest terms. It's like Einstein said, you should, if you really know what you're talking about, you should be able to explain it to a child.
That's true. Let's jump from the US to Europe and to Poland, actually, because how do you think this book can be perceived by Polish people or Europeans? Because since the Russian aggression on Ukraine, actually, nuclear threat is way bigger than ever.
I mean, listen, one of the reasons that the individuals that spoke to me on the record did is because, and this is back in COVID, they said to me, Annie, it's important what you're doing. People seem to have forgotten about the nuclear threat. And here we are just a few years later with the president of Russia threatening the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. This is reckless, it is irresponsible, and it really is in defiance of a concept of deterrence. Now, that said, former President Donald Trump, set the stage for this. So there's some deep responsibility on the U.S. But the fact that this is being threatened is astonishing and I think terrifying, because that kind of tension ratchets up the idea that deterrence might not hold. And that is a very, very sobering thought, terrifying thought. As far as Poland is concerned, here you are on the eastern flank of NATO. I mean, you are right at the edge. So on the one hand, the fear and the feeling and the visceral nature of it all is so much greater, and NATO is there. You know, there's an incredible partnership between Poland and the United States in NATO, very significant. Article 5, I believe in absolutely. And yet at the same time, I think what you realize when you read Nuclear War Scenario is actually geography is immaterial in the most bizarre way when it comes to nuclear war. In seconds and minutes, we're all gone. And so we are all, in essence, partners in this issue. We are all individuals that must together have this understanding that nuclear war is completely unacceptable.
If it may be that extreme, should we actually think about it? You know, because either you nor I, we cannot do anything about it. Or maybe you can't. You can. You can talk to some guys and, you know, just make their mind about it. But seriously, we cannot do nothing. We can do nothing. We're just living. So why? I don't want to say why bother, but why be sad? Maybe just during the day.
Okay, so I'm going to give you my one hopeful note in all of this, which actually is a real boost for what actually, you know, can happen and should happen, and I hope will happen. So Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, was a nuclear hawk. He's a president who believed, we're going back to the 80s now, he's a president who believed when he came into office, more nuclear weapons made America more safe. He wanted to build up the arsenal. He wanted to put weapons in space. The Star Wars program, it was called. And then he had an epiphany. It's called the Reagan reversal. And it came because he watched an ABC TV movie called The Day After. It aired on television in 1983. 100 million Americans watched it, me included. I was in high school, and I was terrified, and everyone was terrified.
Did they do some reruns? Or
You can see it on YouTube. Okay, and you should, because, you know, it's like bad 1980s makeup, and it nails it, because it answers the question which you just asked me, which is, why should we think about this horror?
Yeah.
You know, that's what I thought in 1983 when I saw this TV movie. Like, why did I just watch that? But yet I had to watch it. And so did 100 million other people. But the important person who watched it was Ronald Reagan. And he wrote in his White House journal that he became greatly depressed.
Oh.
You can see that in his journal. And that led him into action. And he reached out to Gorbachev. He reached out to the enemy. America, the arch enemy, was the Soviet Union at the time. Reagan believed that. He watches a television show, thinks these horrible thoughts, and reaches out to the enemy. And as a result, we had the Reykjavik summit. The world went from 70,000 nuclear weapons, 70,000, to approximately 12,500 that we have today. That is why thinking and talking about these things are important, I believe, because you're moving in the right direction. There's no doubt the world is a safer place with 12,500. It's still way too many.
It's still way too many,
But 70,000, think of all the accidents that could happen.
Yeah. But, you pointed at one very important thing, communication. In your book, in Nuclear War, a Scenario, people don't communicate well. They are not picking phones. I'm talking about the leaders, right? They don't reach each other quick enough.
Yeah.
They don't talk to each other. I don't know how this actually connects with the actual world. Like right now, for example, is it possible for Joe Biden to call Vladimir Putin there's war in Ukraine, so it's kind of different or difficult. But in the extreme scenario, would they actually talk, or is it not possible? And because for me, probably this book could end just before it started, of course, with the phone, right? With just a talk, because if there's at one end there's one guy with the nuclear missiles and there's the other guy, they could talk.
They absolutely could. And you have hit upon the heart of the matter, which is communication.
Yes.
And we can think about this in our own lives. But let me get specific here. And actually, Poland is involved in this story this fact-based story I'm about to tell you. So about the lack of communication, because absolutely the systems are there. They were built by JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis out of the fear that, my God, if I can't get Khrushchev on the phone, this is going to end really badly. But despite having the technology there, it does involve two humans to actually speak to each other, and a willingness. And so in the early days of the Ukraine war, the American press erroneously reported that a Russian missile had hit Poland. You may remember that. It was a big deal in the U.S. because those in the know.
Oh yeah, just behind the border.
Yes,
absolutely.
But that's still Poland, and that is a NATO country, and that is an Article 5 violation.
Yes.
And this was like an alarm system going off in the United States.
But it wasn't confirmed it's Russian missile.
That's what it was reported in the United States.
Okay.
It was an error report.
Sure.
And when you report something in the United States, it's like dropping a match in gasoline.
Sure.
It was retweeted and all of this. And so there's this sort of sense. Well, it took 36 hours for Mark Milley, General Mark Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, to do a press conference. And he revealed that he had not yet spoken to his military counterpart in Russia. 36 hours. I mean, we know the world would be ended several times over if this was nuclear war. And so that indicates to you the lack of communication that can happen. That was a hot war, and Milley couldn't get in touch with his Russian counterpart. Someone wasn't answering the phone. And that is a cautionary tale and should concern all of us.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, Joe Biden hasn't spoken to Putin in over 2 years. And you can say, well, that's because of the war. You can say that, and that is a fact. You can also say, what about the nuclear situation that always exists 24/7, 365? Because through this entire hot conflict, those 1,000+ missiles on each side have remained on hair trigger alert, ready for launch in as little as 60 seconds. Shouldn't there be some kind of communication?
Yeah, that's very obvious that it should. Yeah. You don't actually write in the book about smaller nuclear weapon, tactical nukes. Did you research that field, or do you have any thoughts about it? Because this aspect of the nuclear war was, I think, the closest in here, because Putin a couple of times said that he may use some smaller nukes and target London, Warsaw, or any other European country, European city.
So for listeners and viewers, maybe we just do a quick summary of the difference between tactical weapons and strategic weapons. And again, I sometimes think this nomenclature is there to kind of obfuscate the truth, right? It's very simple. It's like a tactical nuclear weapon is designed to be used on the battlefield. And so, and America used to have them in their arsenal, and we don't anymore. And they're, you can see old photographs of them coming out of artillery.
Oh, wow.
Okay? Coming out of a cannon. And you can also call them short-range rockets, essentially. But you get the sense that this is like sort of in the area of the battlefield. A strategic weapon is an intercontinental ballistic missile or launched from a sub, and it goes from one continent to the next. It's a extraordinary distance and at great height. It's 500 miles up. Very hard to shoot down. But the real problem with all of this, and with Putin threatening a tactical weapon, is that a fundamental to deterrence will hold, is that you don't threaten nuclear war. That is a very important psychological component. And so by threatening the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, and the reason is you don't threaten is because the doctrine of deterrence is no nuclear use, period. No means no. It doesn't mean, okay, I'll use a small one. And so by threatening this, I believe that Putin is inviting in the unraveling of deterrence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but also, if it does, why would he? I'm not in his head, but I wonder why would he even put up this topic if he actually didn't mean it.
I agree with
right?
you. I agree with you that it's schoolyard bully talk.
Okay.
Right? It really is. And that's why it's so unfortunate to my eye as a historian and as a journalist that our own former president in the United States threatened, made use of rhetoric with the president of North Korea because, A, it's very unpresidential. And it sets the stage. It opens the floodgates for a discussion that, or rather a threat that simply cannot be made because it threatens the fundamental of deterrence. And this is coming, there are very few things that I would say shouldn't be said because I am all about writing and transparency and speaking your mind. But threatening nuclear use if you are the president of the United States is absolutely one of the things that should not be spoken.
You're right. We didn't talk about this earlier, but I think it's important to actually maybe clarify. Why is it so difficult to intercept ICBM, right?
Yes, and boy, is it shocking to learn that the U.S. interceptors, okay, so let's, quick interceptor story. The ICBMs I just described are these giant rockets that fly from one continent to the other. An interceptor missile is essentially like a baby version of that. Instead of, it's 50 feet long, it's a giant rocket, but instead of having a nuclear warhead in the nose cone, it has what's appropriately named an exo-atmospheric kill vehicle, which basically is just like a giant bowling ball. It's not an explosive warhead. It's just an object, and it's going to attempt to take out a nuclear warhead flying through space at 14,000 miles an hour, 500 miles above the Earth in a direct hit.
Yeah.
It is like shooting a bullet with a bullet. That is a quote from the U.S. Missile Defense Agency.
And we don't have good enough mechanisms to actually shoot it.
Think about how hard that is to do. That's why I gave you those speeds and
those
numbers.
It's 2024, right?
What? It's what?
It's 2024. Come on.
But
we should have it.
But just if you think of the basic physics of it, I mean, this rocket is going to try to. It's shooting a bullet with a bullet, and also we know from the facts of the matter that the interceptor system has a success rate of 40 to 50%.
Okay.
And that doesn't even get into the logistics if you actually have, dummy warheads in the nose cone that are designed to, sort of confuse. So you have multiple in there, which is often, and I get into that a little bit later in the book. And so the bottom line is it is actually a bit of a fantasy, only to be out, fantasized by this sheer number. So I told you there are 1,600 and some odd nuclear weapons in Russia on ready for launch status. North Korea, by the way, has 50. China has 400 or 500. United States has 44 interceptor missiles. I mean, just do the math.
Yeah, not enough. How do you and the experts think about the possibility of a mistake similar to one from November 1979?
And you're talking about the story Bill Perry told me in the book? Yeah. I mean, boy, those nuclear close calls, those nuclear almosts, they are stunning to learn about. There's about 7, 8, 9, 10 of them on the record that we know of. Imagine how many there must be that have never been reported.
Yeah.
But one that I do report in the book was told to me firsthand, meaning by the participant involved. And that was former U.S. Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. And it was 1979. He was a very young man. He was on the night watch. If something happened, it was his job to tell Carter, and lo and behold, he gets a phone call from the Pentagon, from the bunker beneath the Pentagon, the nuclear bunker, that says, my God, we're being attacked by Russia. Not just with ICBMs, but with sub-launched ballistic missiles as well. I mean, there are hundreds of them coming in. And by the way, they say this is confirmed with the information coming from the bunker beneath Stratcom. And so Perry is sitting there realizing that it is now up to him to tell the President of the United States that he has to make a counterattack.
Yeah.
And when Perry was telling me this story all these decades later, I could feel it in his voice, the sort of past remembrance of this incredible, traumatic, shocking moment. And then he said the phone rang, and it was the Pentagon bunker calling again to say it's a mistake. A training test tape had been inserted erroneously into the Pentagon's system. And the reason it showed up in Stratcom is because they're connected. Mm. And this speaks to the idea, my God, a mistake could wind us up in nuclear war.
But is it possible, any more right now or less? Or I don't know.
How has that changed? That is just
I don't know,
human.
security systems.
That is but think about it. It was just a human who inserted that tape, or maybe his elbow.
We don't use
hit
tapes anymore.
We don't use tapes anymore. But the same. Think of how many mistakes happen on a regular basis. I mean, the United Nations Secretary General recently said, "We are one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation." That is a powerful statement. And then he said, "This is madness. We must reverse course." And so I believe, echoing back to this idea of why on earth would I want to read this book that is essentially a horror story? Well, because I believe it propels people into action. That story I told you of Reagan, it didn't happen in a vacuum. If you go back in history and look at what was happening right around that time in 1983, there were massive worldwide protests against nuclear weapons, against the threat of nuclear war. People were scared, and they were scared for good reason. And so the reason that I believe a president picks up that pen, that powerful pen, is because they believe it will help their popularity. And if that's what it takes to move us all in the correct direction, which I believe is toward reduction of nuclear weapons. I'm not talking about overnight fantasy, get rid of them. Of course people cheat. Of course, paranoia is sometimes a bit of a healthy concept to have when dealing with your adversaries. But things can move in that direction. And unfortunately, right now, with the world in this aggressive, all these hostilities and conflicts around the globe, people are thinking that a better move is armoring up. Yeah. And I think that is dangerous.
Oh, I agree. Absolutely. Yes. Slowly coming to an end. It's broad topic, but if you could tell a bit about the long-term effects of a nuclear attack.
Nuclear winter is just astonishing to think about and read about it. It's a theory, a paper that was originally written in the early 80s, led by Carl Sagan, a very famous astrophysicist, and five authors total. One of them was Brian Toon, Sagan's young student at the time. He's with us now. I interview him at great length for the book. And he's dedicated all these decades to studying nuclear winter and modeling it using the computer systems we have today. And Toon explained it to me like this, and I'll give it to you like this because it's just the simplest, most haunting concept of it. After all these nuclear ground zeros, imagining that full-scale nuclear exchange that happens in the end of the book, through misunderstanding, through miscalculation, Russia and the United States end up firing their nuclear weapons at one another. Imagine all these fires burning, cities burning, forests burning. What Professor Toon explained to me is that the climate modeling suggests 330 billion pounds of soot from these fires will be lofted into the atmosphere, and it will block out the sun's warming rays. And there will be large sheets of ice across the mid-latitude for 7, 8, 9 years. This will be the death of agriculture. And with the death of agriculture, you have billions who were living after the strikes die of starvation. And that is how you wind up with 5 billion dead. This says nothing of the plague and the pathogens and the people left living underground. I mean, it's grim and it's dark, and I report it in the book in a succinct manner because we must all understand this is now the truth about what would happen. Originally, the Defense Department said it was communist propaganda.
Yeah.
This is fact. And so, again, another reason why nuclear launch to nuclear winter in this book, but it doesn't have to be that way.
So what has to change?
I think you hit the the nail on the head with the word communication.
Okay.
You know, people, and sort of bringing it back to that idea about like tough leaders and, you know, threatening and, you know, being a cowboy. I mean, I think that, you know, listen, there's a place for that in terms of aggression. But when it comes to nuclear weapons, the communication must be there, even if it exists in its own lane. Even if it's, okay, we may be having this horrific hot war, but we must also have a discussion about our nuclear arsenals. And I believe it's almost like two people involved in a bad divorce, you know? I mean, you know, readers can relate.
Sure.
Because we all know that from a friend or, you know, some people for themselves, how bad it can go from bad to worse, or there is compromise, or there is understanding. And that all begins in communication.
Absolutely. I saw you on Joe Rogan on Lex Fridman podcast, and I checked the comment section on both of them. And many people were commenting that you have really calm voice despite the topic you're taking on, and I agree absolutely. So, just at the end, what should Polish readers, what we should take from your book, from the story? What would you say?
You know, I would hope that the takeaway really is that knowledge is power. It's an old cliche for a reason. It's brilliant, you know, and on the same token, ignorance is not strength. You know, that it's the sort of anti-Orwellian of it all.
Absolutely.
Right? That we need to know about these things because when you know about something, you feel powerful yourself. And also, I think that, I mean, I am an optimist at heart. And so...
Oh, are you?
Absolutely.
Oh.
I couldn't write books like this if I wasn't.
Good to know.
I mean,
sure.
and I do think you can actually, you know, this is a much longer conversation,
sure.
and you can read self-help books about this or, you know, talk to really wise mentors, but you can train your brain toward optimism. This certainly helps as a parent. We're talking about legacy,
sure.
legacy of in our own families and also of the earth, of the world. And so I believe that the optimistic, arm yourself with knowledge and be optimistic.
That's a very uplifting thought at the end. Thank you very much. Annie Jacobsen, Wojna nuklearna, możliwy, scenariusz. Już jest w księgarniach. Bardzo dziękuję. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.